He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Exactly a year ago, Here Now ran a story on the conflict in Sudan. In mid-April last year, fighting had broken out between two factions of the military government, the Army, or SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. Many thousands started fleeing the main cities, hoping to find safety away from the seats of power. Straight away, members of the Sudanese diaspora in New Zealand had been desperately trying to coordinate efforts to locate and relocate their family members to safety in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or Port Sudan. Many were stuck for days either at the Egypt border or at Port Sudan, hoping to get on a ship to Jeddah. I spoke to Dr. Reem Abbas and Dr. Ala Farah in this episode from a year ago.
There are two options at the moment. It's either you go through Port Sudan or you go through the Egyptian border, and it's a hell of a journey with elderly and sick people there, and the situation is really bad.
In Sudan, a struggle for power and control has people fleeing for their lives.
I've been bashing the phone lines and trying to get a hold of family members, and I spent the entire weekend trying to make sure some of them moved to a more secure place. I've also got family members that are now on the way to the Egyptian border, trying to get out if possible.
Tensions between the army and a powerful paramilitary who were once allies now have boiled over, and entire Sudanese neighborhoods across cities are being abandoned.
I mean, what's happening now is just beyond description, so we just need this to stop as soon as possible.
A year on, things have only gotten worse. The conflict has caused over 8 million people to be forcibly displaced from their homes and over 15,000 killed in the fighting across the country. While the world has been focused on the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, aid agencies report millions in Sudan are on the brink of starvation. I got to catch up with Dr. Ala Farah in Auckland recently to see how her family in Sudan had been faring.
The last of my family members just recently left Khartoum. I mean, they persevered for an entire year, despite us pleading with them to, move to a safer place. And when I say safer, the reality is the areas around Khartoum are not safe anymore as well. But I've got an aunt and a cousin that just recently left Khartoum, and we're talking about 4 weeks ago. So they were there for an entire year. They went through the entire experience, and it was the lack of resources that finally drove them to make that journey out of Khartoum. But it was quite a traumatic journey. And in hindsight, I often wonder as to why we haven't encouraged them sooner to leave. But it's really hard to ask someone to make that journey when you know that there's no certainty as to what's going to happen on the way. And my cousin, they were looted on the way. They experienced some harassment. They had to go through various checkpoints, military and RSF checkpoints. And it was a very traumatic experience for them, to say the least. They have made it to safety. I mean, they're now in North Sudan, in a much safer area. However, there's still that uncertainty as to what happens next and what's going to go on from here.
From so far away while feeling helpless, the diaspora has been directing its energy towards raising awareness and advocacy. I'm at an art exhibition where there's also a detailed historical and visual timeline of the conflict at Auckland Studio One. It's the opening night and the gallery is packed with people here to see images of Sudan by Dubai-based documentary photographer Ala Khair and some local New Zealand artists. Lina Khair has a series of her paintings amongst the display.
We know that through art and through photographs and through documentaries and through that kind of visual and creative stimulation, people grow sort of more connected to what's happening on the ground in Sudan.
There's a lack of basic resources, water, electricity, medication, that is all lacking. So unfortunately, for us, it's just a glimpse of what's going on is what we're providing. And the reality is so much more worse than what we've showcased.
What are the calls to action? It's to make sure humanitarian aid gets to where it needs to go, and it's to stop the spread of arms.
Since the war started in 2023, the community has also been lobbying for refugee visas for their family members, and I spoke to the then Foreign Minister Nanaya Mahuta.
Look, we welcome all efforts to see the de-escalation of violence in Sudan, a ceasefire, and returning Sudan to a state of peace.
Will New Zealand look at including any Sudanese representation in our current refugee quota, especially for families of Sudanese Kiwi living here?
Well, that's a consideration for the Minister of Immigration, and as I say, as we continue to observe what is happening in Sudan, we'll certainly continue to reassess our response and an approach, especially in the area of a humanitarian response and further considerations.
The community has kept the campaign going up till now.
I mean, in New Zealand, we had a huge campaign that we sort of pushed through for months, trying to request for a specific reunification pathway to be created for the Sudanese. But unfortunately, we hit a dead wall, and it was just no was the answer. We really empathize with what's happening with your family members overseas, but unfortunately, there's not enough resources to support. And that was it. And we continued to push through that. But despite that, there's no hope in sight in terms of a reunification pathway for our people.
I contacted Immigration New Zealand again to see if this year may offer some hope. Policy Manager Sam Foley says that at this stage there are no plans to create a special humanitarian visa pathway for people from Sudan, and decisions on whether to create that pathway would need to be made by the Cabinet. I visited Sudan in 2019 at the height of the revolution and stayed in one of those classic Sudanese multi-generational homes. There was hope everywhere as the transitional government came into power, ousting autocratic leader Omar al-Bashir after 30 years. Bashir remains in prison for corruption, and the International Criminal Court has charged him with war crimes. The home I lived in Khartoum was a thriving hub of activity, with people constantly pouring in and out, and politics a hot topic of discussion. The house has since been abandoned and raided. Lina Khair again.
One of the biggest tragedies is the collapse of that multi-generational home. That's something that I've been observing lately, which is that, you know, these homes have been multi-generational for generation upon generation upon generation. It takes a long time to establish such a incredible legacy of living together. And so one of the saddest things when people leave is that often they're not all going together. Sometimes one member of the family will get a visa and be able to go relocate to Dubai, and someone else might be able to go to Saudi, whereas some of the family stays in, in a coastal town in Sudan. And it's just that eradication of that collective kind of spirit of being together. I think I've always had a real fascination with our families and our family units. And how close we are, not just our nuclear families, but our cousins and our aunts and our grandparents. And I think the perspective I take with my art is very centered around the centrality of the mother and the women within a family, in terms of how Sudanese culture is often expressed through the rituals of the Sudanese woman. And so I like to kind of portray that within my art and use that as a vehicle for talking about Sudan and Sudanese-ness.
As for the diaspora and people overseas, I mean, as Sudanese, we take a lot of pride in our country. Sudan is home. I lived in Sudan for a few years, and at one point I did consider taking my children back to live there. So I can imagine when we talk about, our elders who've lived there for 50, 60 years of their life, leaving Sudan was never an option for them. And these are people that have got, generational family homes. They have their whole lives out there. And now they're having to deal with a lot of uncertainty.
One person who knows what that steadfastness and pride in their country looks like is DC-raised rapper Odyssey, whose father is Sudanese. He happens to be touring Auckland with his latest album, and I get to meet him after the gig.
The last time I was there was January 2020. My favorite memory, I couldn't pick one. My favorite is walking on Shari al-Nil and drinking chai with my family. Walking on Nile Street and drinking tea with my family for the people who don't understand me.
Amir, his given name, lives in New York, but those Sudanese roots still run deep.
And I'm saddened by how predictable this was. I think every Sudanese person knew the minute they created a transitional council and didn't relinquish immediately, we knew what time it was. Everyone did. We held on to the optimism because this was a form of progress that was unprecedented prior in 36 years or more. So you have to have some sort of hope to hold on to.
Do you still have family there?
My father is still there now. He refused to leave.
Is he in Khartoum?
He is in Omdurman. Yeah. My father's there. I have a few cousins there.
So why do you think your father refuses to leave? Well, at least you're laughing about it. I mean,
You know. I spoke to him today.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. I've learned a lot from him and I owe him a lot. And with that, I will say my father's pride is why he is still in Sudan. He came to the United States in 1976. He operated a series of businesses as an entrepreneur. Some of them failed, some of them succeeded. The one that made him the most of his earnings allowed him to retire quite early, build property in Sudan, have a few businesses, and live a very comfortable life. He lived in the first floor of his building, and he had a really, really good life. And I think the reality for him that if he fled to live in my house or my siblings in DC, what is all of it for? What is all the work for if someone comes and seizes and confiscates your property, takes it as their own, or blows it up and destroys it? What exactly did you exist for? And that's a different answer for everyone. What I would like to see is I would like to see our neighboring countries that are funding both the military and the paramilitary to remove themselves from our interests and our conflict and to leave us alone. I would like to see that because this would stop if they had no funding. That's what I would like to see. At worst, we may see the balkanization of the entire of East Africa, forget just Sudan.
Sudanese diaspora everywhere running low on the optimism a year into the conflict. And here in New Zealand waiting to see if the government is willing to save their families from the horror bearing down on Sudan. Big thanks to Odyssey, Dr. Ala Farah and Lena Kerr for sharing their stories with me on this episode of Here Now. You can follow Here Now on all your favorite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts from. Today's episode was mixed by Daniel Hurley and my name is Kadambari Raghukumar. Thanks for listening.